Welcome to Unlayered. And I'm here with my co-host Dave. Dave, how does it feel to finally be putting out episode 1?
Super excited. I was thinking about this the other day, but I think we first came together around January 2023 talking about this
Yes.
project. And we're 3 months now later, and we're finally now getting to the point releasing that first episode. So I'm psyched.
For our listeners, I'm Saul Kadir, worked in crypto for a while, and Dave and I kind of connected to put this show out here as sort of like an alternative space. We kind of call it an alternative crypto podcast, and we're focusing less on the EVM side and more on Solana specifically. But from your perspective, Dave, what made you think that this type of show and this type of space for Solana was necessary in the first place?
So I'm Dave, and when I think about the crypto space, when you look at all of the big influencers, all of the big media outlets, all of the big VCs, and all of the big podcasts, all of them have this myopic view, this myopic approach that Ethereum is the future of the space. Ethereum scaling is how we're going to get to this global audience, this mass production of block space. And that's how we're going to scale the world onto the blockchain. Personally, I have a number of reservations about that because I'm not denying that Ethereum has first mover advantage. I'm not denying it has the most liquidity, it has the most eyeballs. But what I do think there are issues with is the tech stack. It's how they're actually planning on scaling this to a global audience.
For sure, for sure. And maybe I'll jump on my soapbox here and kind of give my perspective on things. And before I do that, actually, let me just provide a couple disclaimers. One is that most of my net worth is actually not tied to Solana. It's tied to ETH based assets, even Bitcoin. I'm a big Bitcoin fan. That's what got me into crypto in the first place. So, certainly for our listeners, I'm not an extremist. I just think that the design space in Solana specifically is very interesting. I think that approach to scaling is very interesting. And I don't think one chain or one ecosystem will win in the future. So maybe let's start from this ground level where let's assume first that if your thesis is that crypto or Web3 or whatever you want to call it will matter in the future, then we can have a conversation about what that future will look like. And that's kind of what this podcast is about. If you don't think it's a future, then there's no point in even diving into like the intricacies of one ecosystem versus another, Solana versus ETH. But I believe, and Dave believes, and a lot of really smart people believe that crypto is going to be a core primitive of the future of society. It's going to be a core primitive that makes the internet a better place for everybody. One tweet I saw from Balaji recently, and for those who don't know, he's a great thinker, former CTO of Coinbase, wrote a book recently called The Network State. He said, in the age of AI, in the age of things like ChatGPT, for instance, one of the only things that you can't replace with AI is this idea of cryptography and cryptocurrencies. And so just taking that view and understanding in this world, if we zoom or fast forward 20 years, and AI is a huge part of society, obviously, on the generative side, and many other use cases we can't even think of right now. One of the only things that will guarantee to still exist is cryptography based computation, whether it's cryptocurrencies, whether it's things in the zero knowledge world that don't necessarily require crypto. And we'll kind of get into all these specific examples in future episodes. But the point is, in this future that we're clearly trending towards, crypto and Web3 has to be a big part of it, especially as things like AI get popular. And so now when we start from this base, all right, where now we kind of can assume that crypto will matter. Now we can start to have these interesting conversations of what does that look like? What use cases will require crypto? And how does it help society? Early examples from the past cycle, whether it's tokens from the ICO cycle of 2017, going up and down, a lot of them were scams. And more recently, where we saw this boom and bust cycle for NFTs, yes, there's a lot of noise there, but there's also a lot of promise. And if we start even thinking about the NFT use case specifically, non-fungible assets that are digitally native, Solana is a market leader outside of Ethereum. If you look at CryptoSlam's data, they are number 2 behind ETH. They have been number 2 basically forever. And now there's entire protocols like Metaplex that make things easy for developers to mint them at scale. You can enforce royalties even. And just separately, the user experience on the Solana blockchain, And what that means is how you send money to people, trading tokens, creating a wallet, even. Phantom led the charge here. Phantom is a wallet provider with great UI UX dating back to 2021. And now there's exciting new wallets like Backpack that unlock new functionalities. So, all of that to say is we've already seen a ton of interesting things on Solana. Solana has done a lot of interesting things with regards to NFTs already. They are already a market leader. They work. The chain works. It works with great UX, and there's a lot of promising projects and developers continuing to build here. And so that's kind of why we gravitate heavily towards a space which we candidly think is underappreciated and not talked about enough. Certainly on the crypto Twitter sphere.
When you consider about what are the new blockchains coming to the space, it's things like Aptos, it's things like Sui, it's things like Monad. And what do they have in common? They're all these single layer, highly performant blockchains where you can just keep everything on a single shard. And that makes a huge difference to the user experience, user onboarding, as well as the technical difficulties for the developers as well. It all creates this technical debt and confusion, both for developers and for the users. Whereas this new generation of blockchains are utilizing hardware upgrades because we're seeing with this explosion from AI that it's not going to go away anytime soon. And therefore, the hardware will have to keep on improving if AI is going to scale to the world. So these new chains, they're trying to take advantage of those hardware improvements. And the other key feature is that they are parallelizing transactions. So they are doing more than one at the same time. And this is another massive step change improvement on what we've seen to so far with Ethereum.
Exactly. I think that's a salient point also that can kind of be seen as a tailwind for the Solana ecosystem, where the developers in Solana focus heavily on scalability through hardware, as you said. And happening in parallel is this movement in AI computation demand, and just the fact that we need so many chips from NVIDIA and GPUs and things like that. Well, it turns out Solana already scales with parallelization at the GPU level. Solana, and certainly there's probably other blockchains that are doing this. I'm not going to pretend I know every single layer one that's being developed right now, but of the popular ones, it does appear that Solana is best equipped to take advantage of advances in computation, specifically at the GPU side of hardware, right? There's Moore's Law, which is the CPU side, but AI is really accelerating demand for and development of GPUs. And even if the developers at the protocol, the software layer of Solana, stop doing anything, we can get some kind of guaranteed increases in performance just as the hardware industry that Solana leverages and all computation leverages continues to advance. And I think this is a point that's kind of missed or rather forgotten about by a lot of people or critics of this ecosystem in particular.
I think the key point here is it's not that everyone has to agree with us because, Ethereum is the biggest smart contract asset by a mile. It has the most money, the most eyeballs. So a lot of people will disagree with this point. But I think there is a valid debate to be had here, a valid alternative future for blockchain scaling in the form of these highly performant single shard L1s. And at the moment, I just don't see that discussion going on in the crypto space. I think there is too much focus on Ethereum and not enough support, really, from the media, from podcasts, from influencers, or from VCs on these new, highly plausible solutions to scaling blockchains to the world. So that's a large reason for why I've wanted to start this podcast, because I think if chains like Solana are going to succeed, are going to scale to a global audience, I think they need podcasts to scale alongside them, frankly, because they can't just rely on the benevolence of more Ethereum focused podcasts to help get the message out there to the masses. There needs to be this distribution arm, this media arm.
Kind of changing gears here, let's kind of bring it back to the potential listener, right? You guys are listening to this right now. You're trying to evaluate, is this type of show worth it? Let me just make it in concrete terms why this might be of interest to someone like you. Specifically, what I mean by that is why should I care about crypto, right? We talked a lot about this long term vision, like, oh, okay, in 10 or 20 years, we're going to use crypto to do X, Y, Z because AI takes over the world and crypto is the only way you can have scarcity online and you can guarantee things with cryptography that AI can't defeat. Sure, that sounds great. What our job is, we just want to talk to interesting founders and builders in this space and just figure out what they're working on. And it's up to you, the listener, to do your own research, and but certainly use this podcast as a starting point to maybe evaluate various projects that, by definition, are going to be underappreciated because Solana is kind of slept on by a lot of investors and a lot, certainly the crypto Twitter sphere, as we said. And maybe you'll find an opportunity financially that makes sense for you, or maybe you just want to learn about crypto from an alternative perspective that's not so focused on one roadmap, which is defined by the Ethereum ecosystem and all the layers and projects that attach to that. It's just about providing a different perspective. And there's short-term opportunities and long-term opportunities that we think are, potentially a gold mine for listeners here.
Absolutely. So I hope that you'll all join us as we continue to learn about this amazing space and especially the non EVM future blockchains.
So now that you've listened through that lofty introduction to blockchains, to Solana, to what this podcast is all about, I will pause here and allow you to jump ship because the rest of this show from here on out is starting with this episode. We're going down a deep end of crypto. In today's episode, episode 1, Solana is Dead, we'll be interviewing Mert. Mert is a founder and CEO of Helius.xyz. And for those who are not familiar, Helius is the preeminent developer of Solana's leading RPCs, APIs, webhooks, data infrastructure. Think of them as a bunch of developer infrastructure to build applications on top of Solana. So, as we navigate this non EVM side of crypto into our first episode of Unlayered, let's dive first into this interview with Mert and uncover some hidden truths about Solana. Mert, thanks for joining us. I think the first question diving in here is we see this narrative a lot on Twitter, and we've seen you fighting hard on Solana's behalf on Twitter to counter a lot of FUD around this notion that Solana is dead. How would you kind of initially respond to that? You've written about it on Twitter, you've written blog posts, but like, what is your initial reaction to that sentiment?
So to better understand why they say it's dead, it's maybe let's look at the data. I think there was that report published by, I don't even know, was it Token Terminal, that showed that the number of Solana developers has been kind of declining, and there's actually 75 devs, which became a meme because I held a hackathon, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks after that, and we had thousands, right? So
Right.
it obviously wasn't true. The other reason people might say Solana is dead is because of likely DeFi TBL, right?
Yeah.
So that part, DeFi is making a comeback. The thing that happened is kind of like a very unfortunate sequence of events, right? You had FTX happen, SPF stuff. You had the Mango Oracle manipulation attack. You had the chain reliability issues, and then all these things kind of just essentially piled on each other until the TVL was much lower than it was before. And then you also had like I don't know how to say his last name, but Ian and like his 11 personalities, I guess, which really made it seem like there's some shady stuff going on. But like there are now teams like Phoenix, Margin, Cypher, Drift,
Yep.
Zeta, Solent, V2, Mango's coming back, right? So you have all these different teams that are coming back, and they'll be stronger than ever. It's kind of misleading to judge Sol by its TVL because it has a lot of other use cases, like, for example, token incentivized physical infrastructure networks that aren't TVL heavy, but they result in a lot of usage, like HiveMapper, Helium. Render is now coming over as well. You also have like Genesis Go and stuff like that. And then there's also like a lot of payments use cases, NFT finance, which is a thing now, right? Like with the AMMs that we have, compression. So if you just look at the numbers, that narrative just, it doesn't make sense. Like I could just reply with, for example, the Electro Capital developer report, where Solana has the second biggest developer ecosystem after Ethereum, which is particularly interesting because Solana's been around for barely 2.5 years, whereas Ethereum has been around for almost a decade, right? And so bootstrapping that developer community so quick is actually quite impressive. And if you look at the trends as well, right, like the trends are what matters, the numbers are actually trending upwards. I think maybe when people say Solana is dead, it's more so maybe to make themselves feel a little better about what's not the case.
Yeah, no, a lot of good points in there. I looked at this pretty heavily around the time of FTX when I was covering Solana for Galaxy. And what it seemed to me was what was happening was over-indexing to, I guess, Solana's exposure to FTX. Realistically, their exposure was more or less limited to the beginning when they committed some engineers to building Serum. And sure, there was some liquidity for tokens. They were an on ramp. That's about it. Solana had matured significantly past that. SBF stopped tweeting about them for like an entire year. Like he didn't even care about them at that point. Solana created this whole separate ecosystem, but people were so stuck on that narrative because he was such a big figure and because they were like pretty much the only US based centralized exchange that was extremely exposed or at least had a lot of products related to Solana. It was kind of just a death spiral of narrative FUD. But even like the TVL thing. So I agree with you. Like it's a bit problematic to focus on that one metric. That metric doesn't really make a ton of sense. Maybe DEX volume or number of protocols could help kind of control for that a bit. And that's where so many impressive teams have built impressive projects on the DeFi side, on the NFT side, in Solana at parity with some of the leading protocols on the Ethereum side, which is especially impressive given it's not that easy to make a dApp on Solana. You have to learn an entirely new language. There's not a ton of tooling that's transferable from the EVM side. It's all pretty much all had to be made from scratch for Solana devs. So it's an interesting point that I think is not talked about enough.
I would maybe add, like the FTX thing specifically. I mean, I honestly, it feels like history now, but it was actually quite recent. And what most people don't realize is like, you're absolutely right. FTX and SBF especially helped a lot in the early days. So 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. And after that, they didn't do much. And in fact, and I made a post about this, like with the spreadsheet of actual funding numbers. They were actively funding Solana's competitors, right?
Yeah.
Near Polygon, even Sui Aptos.
Yep.
That doesn't seem like it's an exclusive Solana thing. And then they're also even supporting some L2s and stuff. So I think Toli and Ben did a podcast with the Empire guys where Ben talks about this, where it's like they weren't actually super happy about that, like Solana Labs, right? Because you're actually actively funding competitors and you're not even really helping much. Serum was, of course, a big thing, but that happened 2 years ago. And obviously, most of those engineers, and actually probably all those engineers, had no idea what FTX and SBF was like.
I remember Toli saying in an interview that he'd asked them at some point to try and build a decentralized NFT exchange, and basically they'd gone and tried to do their own centralized one
that's
on
right.
FTX.com, and then started investing in these other companies. So he said, yeah, basically since mid 2021, they hadn't really had any involvement in Solana. And I think your point about investing in other platforms is completely valid. I tried to look at when they bought their tokens, what the token price was at that point, and I think it was something like 1.1 billion maybe was the amount that FTX would have put in if they bought like at that price. And they put like 500 million into Polygon. So it's not an order of magnitude more. And similar amounts into Sui, Aptos, all these others. So I think it is overblown. Another line we always hear about is that Ethereum and the EVM has already won. No point trying to compete. Pack your bags.
It's over.
What are your thoughts on that, Mert?
Well, it's funny because I actually used to work at BlackBerry, and BlackBerry had a similar thing where they thought they won, and then Steve Jobs just destroyed them afterwards. So I've seen this multiple times, and basically, like, to claim that a technology has won is to make the statement that all progress indefinitely has stopped, right? Technology doesn't win. It's maybe dominant for a period of time, but you can't just win technology, right? Like Google, for example, won search, right? Okay, now what? Well, now ChatGPT is coming out. That reign is coming to an end. Bing is now coming back as well. There's many cases like this, right? With web browsers, with operating systems, with phones, like Nokia, right? BlackBerry, I said as well. You can't win a technology. What I will say, though, is they obviously have more network effects.
Yeah.
Right. So the EVM has been around for much longer, and therefore and also, like, to be fair, from a developer perspective, Solidity is much easier to learn than not only Rust, but the Ethereum programming model is much easier to learn than Solana's programming model. Those aren't non-trivial blockers or roadblocks, right? And so basically what Solana needs to do to overcome that is, and I've been harping on this for a while now, produce more content, right? Make it more digestible. For example, this podcast is one. You guys are producing more content, but then, like, and if you can just look this up for yourself, if you search up anything related to like Ethereum or Solana, the search results on YouTube, Google, even Twitter are drastically different, right? The Arbitrum airdrop happened the other day. I don't know when you'll air this, but it happened recently. And I looked at like Solana versus Arbitrum. Like I was imagining, okay, if I were entering crypto for the first time today, what would I see? Like if I was a developer deciding on building on between the two, and it's basically all just like shitting on Solana. It's like how to bridge from Solana to Arbitrum, or like here's why you shouldn't buy Solana, but why you should buy Ethereum.
There you go.
Yeah, and like why Arbitrum already has higher TVL than Solana. Like it's all stuff like that. So Ethereum has certainly won so far in terms of narrative and content. Now they obviously haven't won in technology, which is objectively verifiable via on-chain data, right? Like just look at the transaction numbers, look at the decentralization numbers. And I like saying this about Solana as well. It's like we have superior tech, but it's not going to matter unless it's communicated well and often. So I would say they've definitely won in terms of narrative so far, but we're gonna change that.
You bring up an interesting point that I've thought about a lot, and I like the analogy with BlackBerry and the smartphone revolution with iPhones that started, and now Android too. But what about this? And I think probably the best pushback I've heard on that point is, what about you brought it up, the Lindy effects of the networks around the EVM, building dApps using Solidity or similar EVM programming languages like Viper. There's just so much developer tooling, so much developer education around it. So even if you convince a brand new guy that's new to smart contract programming to hop on and build applications in it, it is a lot harder. As a developer, I've looked at both. Are there any other sort of things on the horizon you think that could help close this gap? I mean, how do you see the future of developer experience in Solana?
Yeah, great question. And I'm certainly going to be biased here since I run a developer experience company on Solana. But you're absolutely right. Solidity and EVM is easier to learn, and especially it's friendlier for newcomers to development in general because it's more object oriented, versus Solana is more functional, which is generally much harder, or at least a different paradigm that you're not used to. There are some TypeScript ones coming out as well, so that'll be pretty big. There are people within the foundation who are working on like object-oriented Rust abstractions on top of smart contract. Like it's like Anchor, but object-oriented. And then obviously there are some teams working on like smart contract templates, sort of like the third web, that team. And so that's only on the right side, right? So on a blockchain, you have the right side, which is smart contracts, and you have the read side. The read side, Helius, the company that I'm building, our goal is to improve that experience 10x. So far, I think we've done a good job. For example, we released webhooks, which for some reason weren't present on other chains even. And then now we released it, and then like 5 months after, like QuickNote, Alchemy, and everybody else also has the same thing. But like that part, the read part, I'm super confident we're going to solve and improve, and it's going to be better than the EVM. And also, one thing that people aren't super familiar with unless you've worked on both systems, reading data on the EVM is actually arguably harder than Solana. So for example, if you're reading token balances on EVM, there is not a single call that you make to the Geth client, right? You can't do it. You have to actually reconcile history from the beginning and then add up and follow along the ledger. Whereas on Solana, that's actually stored in a key value database. And so you can just make a call and it just gets it right back for you. So there are parts of Solana's stack where it's actually easier, but of course the tooling is not as mature. I mean, not even close. So that's what Helios is there for, and then there's other teams working on this. One thing I'll say also is that the time will come when, let's say, if you have a thought experiment here, like maybe a developer that's super prominent chooses to build on Ethereum because it's easier to learn or something like that. The network's effect led him to do that.
Sure.
Okay. So now he builds this app, and maybe the app takes off and has product market fit, right? Yay, like one of the first in crypto. But as soon as he gets scale, what's going to happen? Okay. If he's on an L2, I mean, the L2s actually are still not at the stage where they actually help that much because the fees keep increasing on those as well. You saw with the Arbitrum airdrop. Okay, but he also can't build on Ethereum base there, obviously. So what can he do now, right? So the only option really is, if you want to scale, you have to come to Solana. There's nothing else that will solve your problems, unless you start to get like really, really like creative around how you settle transactions and maybe you batch or something like that. That's just a headache, right? And so once we have, and Armani, who I'm sure you guys will have on the show at some point as well.
Yep.
Armani has mentioned this as well. It's like the network effects are real, but like they're kind of a meme because the ecosystem is so small that if there's like one good app that's built on Solana, people will just flock over anyways because they know Solana can support that volume.
Super exciting to hear that Helius is working on this. And you clearly have put a lot of thought into it on the read and write side, as you posited, which I like that framework for thinking about programming on blockchains. One quick follow up is you brought up this notion of object oriented programming and smart contracts. Do you have a view on the Move ecosystem and the blockchains building in that ecosystem? And like, what do you think their future is?
So Helius is actually not like a Solana specific developer platform. My hypothesis is more that you need to pick a niche that is a well-bounded and well-defined market segment. And right now that's highly scalable L1s. And so I've been closely looking at Sui and Aptos. Sui is quite interesting in that they have a superstar team, right? Like Evan has worked on like 4 massive programming languages. I actually made a post like list all the languages you learned in order on Twitter. And like Evan is like, oh, that's cute. Here's some I made. And like he like actually pointed out like LLVM.
It's like longer than most people's list.
Yeah. So he's quite, and like the Sui team is very talented. I mean, there are some things about it, like the objects are like truly first class citizens in that you can like take somebody else's objects and then like mold them to your liking and modify them to your liking. So it's in a way, it's more composable in some aspects. But to be completely clear, I haven't used Move myself. So anything that I say is kind of speculation. So I don't want to, talk out of my parts, just similar to some people on,
you can
on
swear.
CT. Okay, nice. But I will say that I have been talking with Sui, and it's quite clear that they're going to run into the same read problems as Solana, right? Whenever you have a high TPS blockchain with mass scale, it's just a different technical architecture that you need to build around it to index that data. They're going to have, so Solana has problems right now with archival data, indexing data, account states, and Sui will have those exact same problems.
Yep.
Whereas the EVM won't really, because like it's maybe a few terabytes worth of data in 10 years, but Solana is already over 200 terabytes within like 2 years. So like
Wow.
the scale of the data engineering challenges are so different. But I think Sui will also run into the same ones.
Just while we're on the topic of scaling, I mean, again, Twitter narrative declares that ETH and its L2s are the obvious way forward. You've just said that you can't currently scale on Arbitrum, and we all saw how the airdrop went the other day. What are your views on ETH scaling versus Solana's?
I think the L2 approach that ETH is taking isn't necessarily a bad one, but it's a very long-term scaling solution. So like, I don't see it being ready for years. And that's if everything goes to plan, which it probably won't, right? Like that's not how engineering works. Everything goes wrong. And so for them to actually successfully scale is going to take years. And like some people say like, well, you can just add more L2s to scale horizontally. It's like, you can't do that. The data availability layer is the bottleneck. You will run into problems regardless. And so then they have proto-dank sharding, which by the way, evolved from dank sharding, just sharding, and then dank sharding, and then now it's proto-dank sharding, right? So like they keep running into problems and then they just keep pushing the can down the road, which is fine, but like you need to be aware that it's a very long-term strategy. Whereas the immediate problem in crypto is not scaling, right? The immediate problem is we don't have useful applications solving real problems. And so it's nonsensical to work on some insanely advanced scaling problem when there are no apps that require that scale. So instead of working on that, you should be working on products. And where can you do that right now? Solana, right? If you built a product on Solana, the blockchain will scale with your business, right? You throw more hardware at it, and obviously there's software improvements happening with FireDancer, the core stuff. There's even Jito, there's a third client, right? And so improvements are happening. And so like, I don't necessarily want to discourage anybody from working on L2s because I think it's super important to maximize the design space. But at the same time, I am very concerned that there are no actual good products in crypto. And like people, for example, the guy that does like YouTube tech reviews, I think Marquise Brownlee or something like that.
Yeah. MKBHD.
Yeah. He tweeted this morning, and I knew people were going to say this, something like, the speed at which the AI revolution is happening makes crypto seem silly, like something along those lines. And like, aside from the fact that AI has been being worked on for like 60 years at this point, like, it's not like a new field or anything. And crypto, the white paper came out in 2008. Obviously, it's super mistaken, but it's not entirely incorrect because we've been at this since 2008. And with the exception of like the idea of payments, and we have some ideas around digital assets and governance, even social graphs. We haven't really executed any of those perfectly yet. And so the end result is we don't have any useful products with mass PMF, which means that we don't actually need any of these scaling solutions right now, right? Everybody has this indefinite optimism where it's like, well, when the next billion come, we're going to need like this complex network of L2s and now L3s even.
Yeah.
But it's like, why do you think those next billion are going to come if you don't build the products now, right? Like, I don't understand that line of thinking. And I'm not sure if many people agree with me on this, but so the AI revolution is in full force now. I think everybody can see that. And what most people don't realize is AI needs super efficient advancements in hardware to actually keep going.
Right.
Right. And guess what? We already have a blockchain that utilizes advancements in hardware to scale.
Yeah.
Right. Solana. And so it's actually like super silly. And I never understood this when people are like, well, you shouldn't like rely on hardware to scale. It's like, well, that's literally how every piece of technology scales, like TVs, cars, airplanes, transistors, like all this stuff scales with hardware. And now the question is then, okay, well, if you have too strong hardware, does that lead to centralization? And it's like, well, actually, you just need, like, we already have over 3,000 nodes, right? That's already pretty crazy. That's much higher than most other networks, with the exception of Ethereum.
Right.
And you just need to be able to trust or verify other full nodes, which you can do with light clients, which are already in the works today, right? And so once that goes live, I'm super curious what people are going to say then about how Solana doesn't scale, because I mean, that's pretty much all the objections tackled at that point. But
Yeah.
Anyway, so the TLDR, to answer your question, like what was the scaling? What are my thoughts on it? I think ETH is very long term, and I think it's kind of indefinite optimism in that we don't really need those. Like, it's not the bottleneck. And then I think Solana also. I mean, Solana's not by any means super scalable right now, right? I posted a tweet about like a thought experiment. What would happen if Solana had like 100x demand at this very second? And totally tweeted like or replied like there would be a mad rush to get more hardware, and then it would maybe take like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Now, so I mean, obviously that's much shorter than like 4 or 5 years that it'll take for sharding and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But like the pragmatism of Solana is super underrated.
I have a couple quick questions following up on the hardware side, because I've thought about this too. Is that, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, CPUs will theoretically, as they advance, decrease block times, and GPUs will increase throughput through parallelization. Is that the right way to think about that high level for Solana?
I'm not sure if that's what would currently happen. I think we would need to essentially take advantage of that somehow. But I think that's right.
And the reason I bring up that, and it's a very crude framework to think about it, but the reason I bring it up is, and maybe I'm wrong about this too, but like Moore's law has been kind of on the CPU side, I'm saying, slowing down, or at least it's not advancing at a very high rate. Like even anecdotally, the CPUs in my computer versus 3 or even 5 years ago, or they're kind of in the same ballpark. And ignoring kind of Apple's M1 revolution, which is another thing. But to your point, AI is definitely driving a tremendous demand and obviously both sides of computation, but certainly on the graphics card side for all the parallelization for training models. And I guess my question is kind of higher level. Like, if this is the vision for Solana to scale, I mean, can it handle like 1,000 or 100,000 x increase in users on the blockchain? Like, because I think that's where some of the fear comes from on like the Ethereum side, is maybe they don't necessarily buy into that vision the way maybe we do. And that's why they're so obsessed with that crazy graphic of Ethereum's roadmap, which has like a gazillion things on it. It's broken into all those tiers and the funny names. So certainly I think I understand their perspective on that side. And I don't really have an answer on it, but it seems to me like perhaps that's where some of the concern comes from.
Yeah. And funny enough, I also tweeted about something similar. It's like when I talk to ETH folks, their thing is kind of like ETH doesn't scale now, but ETH doesn't scale now, but it will in the future. Versus Solana scales now, but maybe it won't in the future. The reason it's mistaken is because, like I said, the bottleneck is not the L2s or the compute. It's the data availability at the base layer. So unless you improve the base layer, which they're not going to do for years, and even with dank sharding, it's not going to be enough, right? Like, okay, let's assume they implemented proto dank sharding and all these L2s. Okay, what now when you reach bottleneck of demand, right? Or not a bottleneck of demand, but just a lot of demand. Okay, what happens? Well, now you have no choice but to increase hardware requirements. Okay, and also maybe you need to paralyze the EVM or something. Okay, but there's already a blockchain that kind of does that, and it was designed for that from the beginning. So if you play it out, eventually it almost seems like Solana's architecture is like you just converge to it at some point. And by the way, there's no reason why Solana can't add L2s as well.
Sure.
Right. So one thing that I like to point out is like people will say like, well, Ethereum has this wallet-centric scale like a roadmap, and it's like, okay, I mean, Solana can also add it, right? Like we just don't need it right now.
Yeah.
It's not like ETH needed it at first either, right? They pivoted to it when they found out there were bottlenecks.
Exactly.
But Solana's not even at that stage yet. If Solana did have like this massive 2-3 orders of magnitude increase in demand overnight, you would need probably a week or two for the validators to catch up and figure out how to deal with it with increased hardware requirements. But if you maybe expand that time horizon, right? I mean, usually demand isn't in a pattern such that it happens instantaneously. If you do expand the time horizon, you have things like obviously Fire Dancer. There's actually quite a few other improvements and patches being released as well. And then let's not forget, there's also local fee markets, right? So on Ethereum, for example, state contention in one piece of state will cause the entire network's gas prices to go up, whereas on Solana, it'll just be for that program. And so the user experience for everybody else is unaffected. And so it's kind of like a lose-lose or like a win-win situation for Solana, right? It's like, okay, if L2s end up being this, remarkable thing that for some reason maybe there's a step function improvement that I'm not foreseeing, it's like, okay, well, Solana can actually add L2s, right? There's nothing limiting us from doing that. Or even app chains like interoperability, whatever, right? Like Wormhole is already on Solana. And then if it's not the case, if L2s aren't the solution, maybe the solution is more like just efficiencies at the base software level as well as hardware requirements. And it's like, well, Solana is already doing that. All that is to say, we can worry about that when there's actual products with usability, which just doesn't seem like it's happening.
Yeah. I think I like a lot of the points you made. And I'm just going to make a quick comment before I think Dave has a question. But when I was researching at Galaxy, it was kind of my job to look at a lot of ecosystems, and we would make these graphics of like, all right, what does the world of monolithic chains look like versus app chains versus modular? And it kind of hit me. It's kind of a very silly thought, but like ETH is literally just a monolithic chain. Like the thing that most people used during the airdrop of ape tokens, all of the NFT mania on OpenSea, they weren't using any sort of modular solution at all. They were literally just using a monolithic chain, and it captivated the world. I mean, lots of people used it. Lots of people were talking about it. And this point you bring up that Solana, its base monolithic layer we're talking about is way more scalable than Ethereum. And there's nothing preventing adding the same stuff that they're doing on Ethereum to Solana, it's almost like you're inverting the order of operations here, where the base layer is super scalable and you can add the other stuff. ETH is not scalable at all, which is why Solana got popular in my view in 2021 during like the beginning of NFT season. So I just think it's important to point that out.
Absolutely. And one thing else that I'll mention, which and I think this is super underappreciated. The idea is that Solana is monolithic and ETH is modular, right? Okay. Well, actually, if you play it out, right? So the way ETH works is state and logic are coupled together. So you must have both of those in the same contract, which is by definition monolithic. Solana is actually more modular at the base layer because it separates state and logic. Okay, so it's actually functional. And so at the base layer, it's much more modular than ETH even. And then actually, so Solana now, there's this new primitive called compression. And compression is essentially an L2 internally on account state. So instead of storing the data on state, which is expensive, you store it on the ledger, and then you link it with a Merkle tree. At the base layer, it's recursively more modular by at least 2 orders of magnitude than Ethereum. And so, I don't know. It just feels silly to me.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting what you're saying about compression. And I saw you did a couple of tweets on it, that this could theoretically be considered, as you say, a sort of internal L2 to expand for scaling. I mean, what sort of use cases do you think? I know at the moment it's being used for NFTs. Can it be used to compress other forms of data?
Absolutely. So the great thing is that, so in Solana, everything that holds data is an account, and NFTs are like an instance of an account, but compression can be extended to any account. So a good example of this, for example, actually there's a few. But so, for example, Helium is migrating to Solana, and they're using NFTs to represent their hotspots, and they have a few 100,000, and that's only affordable on Solana, where compression reduces the cost of that, right? Dialect is playing around with this new idea of sticker packs as NFTs, which is only possible like within a chat app due to the mass volume due to compression. And then there's two other super cool ones. So there's Gum, which is like a social kind of platform, social network kind of primitive. And since you can actually compress any account, this actually is perfect for social media, because now you can store, like, for example, imagine your entire tweet history and your social graph and all your activity. You can now store that for basically no cost at all, right? And so it's actually like a huge improvement. So that's, and then also, I don't know if you guys saw, but Render, for example, is questioning migrating over from Polygon to Solana, and I'm pretty sure they will. And they actually reference compression, and they say, like, this tech opens up some super interesting use cases. And an example that they use is using the NFTs for scene graphs and then storing like different scenes, which is like, I didn't even know that was a thing that was possible, but like it's super cool. And it's only possible because it's just so much cheaper to now store account data. And this doesn't, like I said, it's not just for NFTs. Helios is working on making it accessible for regular tokens as well. I'm not sure if my co-founders will like that I said that, but so we're working on that, and then it's going to just expand to all accounts. And so, there's actually some ideas around it which I probably can't disclose, but you can actually add tokens to the compression stuff, and you can do some very interesting decentralized indexing primitives. So yeah, it's super underrated right now.
So it's incredible. It genuinely seems like transformative and like a first in the blockchain space. I saw that Dialect are using this compression technology to what they've been doing is giving out free NFTs basically as stickers to their users. And it feels like this could be the start of business models where you don't have to pay. So you were just talking about social media potentially using this technology. We could presumably start having free social media applications. Do you think that would be possible using this technology where it gets this tiny fees that you're paying get paid by the social media platform and they monetize elsewhere?
Absolutely. Funny enough, again, I did make a tweet about this kind of similarly, where it's like you don't pay Google for emails, right? And in fact, you don't pay many social apps anything. On crypto right now, one of the big problems is the hyper financialization of it, which is that everything's a transaction and you have to approve this transaction, pay money to literally breathe. But with compression, that allows the businesses to be able to afford those costs on their own, increase their margins, and open up new business models. So you mentioned Dialect, but Crossmint also issued an airdrop of 300,000 NFTs, right? So 300,000, that's quite a bit. And so they were able to airdrop that purely from their own wallet, right? The users didn't have to pay for it. There's another team called Driphaus, which used to be formerly Solana Spaces, but now they do more like NFTs and NFT airdrops and stuff like that. They also utilize this tech to airdrop people for free. And so what you're saying absolutely makes sense and is almost inevitable.
When you were talking earlier about, that we need to find product market fit, and I completely agree with that. It feels to me that this advance of these decentralized physical infrastructure projects could well be one of those major drivers, because when you actually look into the business models and understand what's going on, something like Helium is reducing the capital costs of a traditional wireless provider by about 95% or something insane like that. So it's almost like when the internet came around and suddenly newspaper publishing, the costs reduced by 95%. And it feels like a real aha moment in crypto that there is these types of projects where, again, you can reduce costs by 95%. Yeah, so, and it feels like Solana is becoming this hub for these deep in projects as well. So yeah, super exciting.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And token incentivized physical infra networks are, by far my favorite application of crypto so far. And it's because it's this intersection of crypto, but also hard tech, right? So taking on the telecom giants is insanely inspiring and actually an actual use case of crypto. And it's being used in a very interesting way here. Now, Helium will have many challenges here, right? It's going to be super, super difficult to actually accomplish this. But just the idea that it's even possible is super inspiring. I live in Canada where everything is dominated by two telecom companies and everything is insanely expensive, right? And so there's Helium is just one instance of this. There's HiveMapper, which does decentralized mapping, and they're already actually like their growth has gone vertical. Like if you follow their CEO, their growth numbers are insane. So that's quite inspiring. There's even like decentralized weather that uses like Helium. There is obviously decentralized GPU rendering, decentralized storage, decentralized file sharing. I have some other ideas on this as well. Maybe they're super stupid, but I think they could be useful, like decentralized, like real time, like monitoring of like certain high frequency areas, like maybe like the lines at a restaurant or like a bar or something. I don't know. I think, and especially with Saga, you can start to do some interesting proof of like physical activity stuff, right? Like with the mobile phone coming out. Anyways, I think it's just kind of beginning now, and like Solana is the chain to support all of that because low fees, low mass tokenization costs, etc.
So on that point, because I am actually very bullish Deepin as well. I think a lot of people are, and that's kind of like the acronym I think Messari puts out for decentralized physical infrastructure networks. I've always been curious, and it's a happy thing that they all choose to build on Solana. But is it, to your point, is it because of the low fees? Because there's a lot of transactions happening on chain to power these networks, and do we ever see any threat of other chains or layers, layer twos or other ecosystems kind of capturing that market over time?
And totally made a tweet about this the other day as well. What he said, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but it was along the lines of like, no matter how much L2 scale or advance or decentralized, the base fees will never be as low as Solana itself.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, Arbitrum fees were like on the order of a few dollars, but Solana is like 0.000005 Sol, which is like a thousandth of a penny. Obviously, it doesn't make a difference on the scale of one, but if n equals a billion, that's kind of a huge difference. It's also important with L2s to be cognizant of the fact that they fragment states, right? And so Solana is a global state machine, right? So you have somebody in, I don't know, Tokyo, and then within 400 milliseconds, somebody in New York will understand, will get the same message. With an L2, that's not a guarantee. And within, like, let's say you're doing an energy grid or something that's actually like super critical in terms of latency. That latency is not going to be acceptable. You need a global settlement layer. I should actually probably know my research a bit better than this. I mean, Helium put out an entire thing, Renner put out an entire thing of why they're choosing Solana. The TLDRs, the lower fees, are super hard to accomplish on an L2, like at the order of Solana, but also global settlements and the parallelization of states. So, for example, if a lot of people are using Helium Hotspot B, or I don't know, something like that, I don't know how they're going to represent it on chain, but then that causes the gas fees of Helium's other applications to go up. That's not really going to work. What's interesting is, for example, Render. One of the reasons Render is choosing to come to Solana is because they saw that it works. Like they saw what Helium did, and they got inspired by it. So there's like this intra micro network effect where like these deep in projects see other deep in projects doing it and succeeding, and they're like, okay, well now we can also do it. And then so now you kind of have this narrative where it's like Solana is for the deep in products.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably maybe a little underappreciated, but like I think that'll be pretty big after we get a few more on the chain.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen that pattern play out in other ecosystems. ETH became the chain for NFTs, and Solana to an extent too. It's basically number two across all metrics in that vertical. So one thing you reminded me of, it's something I've thought about before, and I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if anyone really does, but it's this idea of block space demand over time. And the crude analogy I'll make here is like broadband. So in the 90s, you didn't really need a ton of broadband because you weren't doing anything crazy in the internet. You were looking at like raw HTML pages. But then as broadband got better over time, people were then like, oh, I can now stream videos. And then when people started streaming videos, it's like, oh, I can want to do it on my phone. And then now I want to do it in 4K. Now I want to do VR. And so it's like, even as we kind of establish a new sort of base level for infrastructure and broadband speeds, it almost seems like demand just constantly catches up. And so I just wonder how that will play out with block space demand, especially as we think about DeepIn, where a lot of things are going to be connected to chains. It's not just people anymore. They're all going to be pinging the chain for different state changes. I just wonder how that plays out over time. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I actually interestingly have. I wrote kind of a post on this about like a hypothetical scenario. I think I titled it like the future of crypto in like 2040 or something. Here's maybe my approximation of it, and I don't think anybody really knows the answer. And I see it more like a Visa and MasterCard situation. So if you look at, and I looked at the numbers here, if you look at the numbers of Visa and MasterCard, their adoption happening, but it's not fast. Like their growth numbers are actually slowed down, right? Because once you get everybody on financial rails, right, it's not like the population is such that you need to get just much more people, and then like it's not like those people are just going to keep transacting exponentially more over time. Maybe, but that just hasn't happened so far. And so that's kind of what I see it as. Like once you get everybody on the networks, it's like, does usage increase exponentially still, or does it maybe increase linearly or logarithmically? I would bet maybe it's something more similar to like MasterCard and Visa, where it's like for sure slowed down. Like if you look at the charts, let's play devil's advocate. Let's say that doesn't happen, and let's say the usage actually keeps increasing, such that like the second derivative of the position equation is a positive, which means it's concave up, and so it's always increasing. And so in that case, you can start to get probably creative, right? Like you can start doing maybe batch functions. So Solana actually totally proposed this thing like asynchronous state execution, I think is something, I forget the exact name. Whereas like there are a bunch of applications that actually aren't time critical. Like you can add the transactions, and then maybe you have like a second process that picks those up and then batches them at the end of some time period, which is actually how ACH works today, like the traditional payment rails, right? And so you can start to get creative at the application or like even the protocol layer in terms of how the software is structured. If it's like if we actually can't keep up with the block space or the demand. And then here's another thing with that is like, for example, let's assume that the problem you're describing happened on ETH, right? Now, as I said earlier, you can't actually keep adding new L2s to help with that because you're bottlenecked by the data availability layer at the base layer. And so that leads us back to the fact that you need a scalable base layer like Solana that can actually handle the data availability. And so even in that case, I don't see how L2s on Ethereum would help. The teams will have sort of like multiple options. They either use Solana where it can actually handle it, and maybe there's a situation where it doesn't handle it, and then maybe you need to add L2 to Solana, or those teams get their own app chains, right? And they just go fully vertical, and maybe they use Cosmos or something that would just have their entire own chains like DYDX, and then maybe you now have these patchworks of interoperability and bridges between them. That seems kind of unlikely to me, but it is possible. So I think maybe it's like potentially those futures.
Just want to touch on payments quickly because I know you've got experience working at banks, and I think you're quite bullish on payments in Solana. Do you think it's the unlock of both the blockchain and potentially a phone like Saga, which is sort of that key unlock to actually finally bringing, this? It was like the first thesis for blockchain, what they would be used for. Do you think that maybe we now have the keys to actually unlock it for the wider population?
I mean, I certainly agree that payments are like a big unlock, and I think it's like probably the major thing that crypto does have product market fit with, just digital payments. I think Saga certainly helps, and I mean, for example, that's what I use my Saga for. There's this app called Otter, which is essentially a Venmo alternative, and it's actually created by the guys who worked on Cash App at Square. So like it's very well made. I actually sent it to not my in-laws yet, but my girlfriend's parents for just easy payments, and then they just go to a link and they just scratch the thing and they have money. Simple as that. Internet money. Well, USDC, but it's on the internet, right? And so I think Saga will certainly help. I'm not sure exactly to the extent where it will help, but it will help. But I think the much bigger thing with payments is how do you get, I mean, there's multiple things here. It's like, one, how do you get merchants to actually want to accept this stuff? Right? That's big, because if you have crypto, you need to be able to use it, and it's quite annoying to be able like have to off ramp it all the time. Especially like, for example, my dad's in Turkey. I don't really trust the Turkish banks to not seize my money if I'm converting, and like that's actually a legit concern. In the West, that's probably not actually a legit concern. In Turkey, it's a legit concern, right? There was inflation that happened and that debased the lira by like 70%.
Oh wow!
This is all real stuff. Like this is like I went to Turkey on summer vacation, and I spent like $100 the whole time. I was like rich with that money. Like it was crazy. I'm Turkish, right? And so the current on-ramp, off-ramp situation is quite weird because every jurisdiction has different regulations, and like how do you know? Like it's just a mess, right? And so the way that Jeremy, like the CEO of USDC, or Circle puts this is like the current payment system is such that you have all these walled gardens that are disconnected, right? You have walled gardens. Like if I want to send money from here to Australia, if I'm wiring the money, it actually has to travel through various jurisdictions. It takes like multiple hops. And then like there's needs to be like currency conversions. There needs to be a whole lot of stuff. It costs you money. It's certainly not quick, and it's horrible UX. I mean, for example, if there's even like the banks might reject your wires for any sorts of random silly reasons, which I'm sure everybody has kind of experienced. And so the thing with payments is, I mean, Solana Pay already clearly works. Obviously, it can be still improved, but it's already quite good. It's like, okay, well, what incentivizes merchants to accept this and actually hold on to it? Or maybe is there a universal way of improving on and off ramps? Right. So those two things are quite important. And then there's some apps on Solana that kind of abstract this for you now. You maybe pay with Apple Pay or something, and in the back end does conversions and the swaps and stuff. But that's, I mean, it's much better than the existing solution, but it's not right. I mean, the end goal ultimately is we need to be able to make crypto accepted as currency or some version of that. Otherwise, we're always reliant on centralized points of failure like off ramps.
Just moving the conversation onto Solana, the narrative. How are we going to improve the narrative, do you think, moving forwards? Because arguably, some would say narrative is more important than tech. And you feel like Solana is, I would say, objectively a superior tech stack at this point compared to basically every other chain. But somehow the narrative is probably one of the worst. So how do you think Solana can get out of this and prosper going forwards?
One of the core problems in crypto is the coins and the networks, when they're held by like regular people who maybe, let's say, aren't knowledgeable about blockchain tech and trade-offs. Since they have the coin, they either make money from it or they expect to make money from it, and then that's their incentive. And so that incentive makes them act out in some pretty weird ways, not unlike politics, where they just start spreading a bunch of stuff that's false because either one, they truly believe it, or two, they want to push their own narrative because that's their investment and they don't want to admit that they were wrong. And so what you end up with is this field where the signal to noise ratio is insanely subpar. Like it is awful. Okay, so what can you do about that? Well, the two things you can really do, right, are you either reduce the noise or you increase the signal. Reducing the noise is not in your immediate control, right? Like you can't just tell people to shut up and then they'll just shut up. That's usually not going to happen. And so what you can do is you can try to increase signal. And how do you increase signal? Well, first you need to know what you're talking about, right? And so you need to learn and you need to do research and you need to do that always, right? That's a non-negotiable. That should be like, you just need that mindset of just always learning, because blockchains are super complex and you need to be able to understand what these new changes are, for example. Number two is, of course, it's not remotely enough to just know the stuff. You need to know how to articulate it and formulate it. And number three is, once all that is the 1 and 2 are done, you then need to make communications a top priority. So like pushing out content, right? Like, here is what Solana is releasing. Here's what's cool about it. Here's why it's going to help you. Like Ethereum and Polygon do a really good job of this. They will hype something up that's like insanely trivial and make it seem like it's like the second coming of Christ or something. Like and like it's actually super impressive. Like they explain like super complex topics and then they make it simple and then everybody rallies around them. And Solana doesn't do that. Solana's more like, well, we're super smart and then like here we're going to make the chain better, and then maybe like me or like Lane or like some of the validators will talk about it. So like to help the narrative, what we need to do is we just need to highlight what we're doing and we need to communicate it effectively, right? Like Helium is building on here, HiveMapper is building on here, Render is building on here, Dialect is building on here, Crossmate. Like there's all these super like awesome teams. We have order books, right? Here's how we're going to scale. So we just and like, for example, if you Google Solana, as I said earlier, you're just going to see some ridiculous stuff, like all about scam coins and why you should buy L2s instead. And so we need to make, and like part of this has to do with the reason that EVM has been around for like 8 years and Solana is new. And so SEO takes time to build. It's not an overnight thing, but like we need to just have that mindset of like, it's not enough to build. It's super important to communicate. In fact, I mean, I'm not going to say it's more important, but it's essentially just as important, right? Like it's in a typical product, you build a product and you have distribution, right? And so both are super important. You have the sales and marketing function, and you have the product function. In crypto, I don't think it's different, but like maybe you can kind of reframe it like you have the tech, the base layer protocol, and then you have the communications, right? And so those kind of go hand in hand. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do, just trying to communicate. Some people really don't like my approach to like you're being too aggressive, you're attacking people. Some people really like it. So I'm not sure if what I'm doing is correct, but it's just who I am.
I remember Polygon bigging up their hard fork as as one of these second coming of Christ, as, the 13-person decision hard fork.
Like they went hard with that, right? Like they did an exclusive with the block. Like so they paid news organizations to actually cover, which is, I mean, smart. But yeah, like to your point, Sal, it's like, I mean, just like product, you can either make a good product or you make a shit product. But with communication, it's the same. You can either communicate in a shitty way or you can communicate in a good way. Shitty way would be like, we're going to make an announcement tomorrow, and then which the announcement is actually an announcement of another announcement. Or you can actually like make some like solid, easy to follow content that adds value, right? Like there's a good way and bad way for execution for both those ideas.
For sure.
Decentralized physical infrastructure networks. I think that's the thing to watch. I think that's a clear area where crypto has a very interesting advantage over traditional mechanics. And it's this amazing combination of hard tech, physical reality, and the digital world, and then tokens. And so it's super interesting. And I think I would be very happy if more people started thinking about that and focusing on that. And I think that actually like significantly, like it meaningfully has a chance to change somewhat the structure of the world. Right. I think that could be super interesting. But other than that, I think people will just gravitate to what they're interested in. If you're a finance guy, you'll watch for DeFi. If you're an NFT guy, you'll watch for the next DGen collection. If you're a hardware nerd, you'll look at maybe MEV. Actually, that's probably something else that Solana specific folks can see. Fire Dancer and MEV with Jito. I think those things are super early, but you can see Jito's actually increasing their stake size quite frequently, and that will actually lead to better performance for Solana as well. So I think people should really keep a close eye on that.
Yeah, I think it's at 20% was the last time I saw. And as you say, a lot of the blocks and block space is currently being used up by these spam MEV transactions. So yeah, I'm all for it. I'm really pleased that they're seeing significant growth now. I completely agree with you on these deep in projects, because you think how difficult it is for crypto to actually interact with real people in the real world outside of this sort of 10 million people who live on chain, and you feel like deep in projects could well be one of the things which actually brings value to normal people, and you can sort of obfuscate the crypto underneath and actually bring real change to the world. So super hyped that we're building this huge community of projects on Solana.
Well, Mert, really appreciate you coming on. We know you have to get back to building some insane developer infrastructure at Helius, and appreciate you coming on the show. Hope to chat again soon.
Yeah, likewise, guys. Thanks for having me. It was a real honor.